Midnight had teeth on the Wyoming prairie. The wind came hard across the open land, dragging snow against Jaime Carter's ranch house in long, furious sweeps. The porch light cut a weak yellow circle into the storm, but beyond that, the world was gone. No fence line, no road, no horizon, just black sky, white drift, and the sound of winter trying to break everything it touched. Inside, Jaime sat alone at her kitchen table with a cooling mug of coffee and a lantern glowing low beside her. The power had flickered twice in the last hour. The old house groaned around her, every board and window frame answering the wind like a body under pressure. Then she heard it. A sharp, solid odor against the porch. Not a branch, not loose metal. A knock. She lifted her head. Silence lasted only a second before it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Jaime went still. Her first thought was human. Someone was outside, a stranded driver, a neighbor in trouble. But the thought died almost as soon as it came. No one came out this far in a blizzard after midnight, not unless they were desperate. The sound came again, stronger now. Not a fist. A hoof. Every muscle in Jaime's body tightened. She stood, crossed the room, and stopped at the door. For one strange second, her hand hovered over the lock as if some part of her already knew that whatever waited outside would change the shape of the night. She flipped on the porch light. The storm lit up in spinning white. And there she was, the mare, wild, thin. Ice crusted along her mane and shoulders, steam pouring from her nostrils in urgent bursts. Her dark body trembled under the light, but she did not back away. She stood on Jaime's porch like a creature who had crossed a line she had once believed could never be crossed. Jaime's breath caught. She knew that mare. For weeks, she had watched her from a distance through a camera lens and through the kitchen window at dusk. The leader of the small wild band that sometimes crossed the far edge of her property. Careful. Proud. Always the last to step toward the hay Jaime left near the ridge. Always the first to lift her head and stare back toward the house. A silent understanding had grown between them. Respect without closeness. Recognition without touch. But this was different. Wild animals did not come to doors. Wild mothers did not walk onto porches, not unless the world behind them had become even more terrifying than the human in front of them. Jaime opened the door slowly. The cold hit her at once, brutal and immediate. Snow blew across the threshold. The mare held her ground. Her eyes found Jaime's face with an intensity so raw it almost didn't feel animal. There was no threat in her stance, no challenge, only strain, only urgency. Then Jaime looked down. At first, all she saw was drifted snow against the porch steps. Then the shape resolved, and her heart seemed to stop. A foal, tiny, newborn, half buried in wind-blown, white. His legs were folded under him at awkward angles. His coat was still damp in places, already stiffening in the cold. His whole body trembled in weak, uneven shivers. He tried to lift his head, managed only an inch, and let it fall again. Jaime stared, unable to move. The mare lowered her head and nudged the foal once, softly, desperately. Then she looked back at Jaime. That look did it. It broke through every last layer of caution. Because this was no wild challenge, no test of nerve, it was a plea. Stripped bare by hunger, pain, and weather. A mother with nothing left except the terrible hope that maybe the human woman she had watched from the ridge would understand. Jaime felt the truth land in her chest all at once. The mare had not come here by accident. She had brought him, not as a gift, as a last chance. You came to me, Jaime whispered. Her own voice sounded fragile in the storm. The mare's flanks heaved. Her ribs showed sharply beneath her winter coat. Snow clung to her lashes. She was exhausted. Beyond exhaustion, really. She looked like an animal who had pushed herself past instinct, past fear, past pride, because something stronger had taken over. Her baby was dying, and she had chosen to trust the one creature she should have feared. Jaime stepped onto the porch slowly, every movement careful. She knew better than to rush a wild mare, especially one with a newborn. One wrong move and panic could turn deadly. But Luna, though Jaime had never spoken the name aloud, she had given it to the mare in her notes, did not lash out. She only watched. Jaime crouched beside the foal. The cold had already sunk deep into his body. She could feel it through her gloves, a terrible absence where warmth should have been. His breathing was shallow, his little ribs fluttering weakly. Too weak to cry. Too weak, maybe, to fight. Alive, but only just. The wind roared across the porch, swirling snow around Jaime's boots. Behind her, the house, glowed with heat and shelter. In front of her, the prairie stood waiting to take this newborn back. She slipped one arm beneath the foal's chest, the other under his hindquarters. He was shockingly light, not the sturdy weight of a healthy colt, but something frail and unfinished, as if life itself had let go too soon. The mare shifted suddenly. Her hoof scraped the boards. Jaime froze, her pulse hammering. For one suspended second, nothing moved except the snow. Then the mare stepped closer, not attacking, not retreating, just close enough to look down at the foal in Jaime's arms, close enough for Jaime to hear the rough, broken sound of her breathing, close enough to understand the enormity of what was happening. This wild creature was allowing it, allowing a human to lift her newborn, allowing the impossible because the alternative was death. Jaime looked up at her, her throat tightening. "Okay," she said softly, like a promise. "Okay, I've got him." The mare's ears flicked. Her body shook, but she did not stop her. And that was the moment Jaime understood this night for what it was. Not luck, not coincidence. Trust, driven to its final edge. A bridge built out of hunger, storm, and desperation. And if she failed now, she would lose more than a foal. She would fail the one thing the wild had placed in her hands and asked her, just once, not to betray. Long before the knocking started, Jaime Carter had built her life around silence. Not peace, not healing. Silence. There was a difference, though most people would not have seen it from the outside. From the road, her ranch looked like the picture of a second chance. A modest house, a weathered barn, open land rolling into the Wyoming distance. Clean air, big sky, the kind of place people imagined when they talked about starting over. But Jaime had not come here to begin again. She had come here to disappear in a way that still looked respectable. At 42, she had the kind of face that had learned control the hard way. Composed, observant, beautiful in a quiet, unadvertised way. In the city, that face had once belonged in polished conference rooms and courthouse hallways under fluorescent lights and beside stacks of legal briefs. She had been sharp, relentless, expensive. The attorney people hired when the stakes were high and the truth had already started to bend under money. Now her mornings began before sunrise with black coffee and cold floors. No makeup, no heels, no arguments waiting in her inbox, just wool socks, a heavy sweater, and the ritual she trusted because it asked nothing from her except repetition. She would boil water, grind beans, stand at the kitchen window while the first light spread across the prairie in thin silver bands. Some mornings she lifted her camera before she lifted her cup. Some mornings she just stood there and watched the emptiness, as if the land itself were making a promise she had not yet learned how to believe. Then she worked, camera bag over one shoulder, long lens wrapped against the cold, gloves, batteries, a thermos. She walked ridgelines and frozen creek beds, following tracks most people would never notice. Mule deer, coyotes, fox, red-tailed hawks turning circles over the open grass. She photographed movement, weather, distance, wild things that did not ask to be understood. That was why she preferred them. Animals did not lie to protect themselves and call it strategy. Animals did not bury guilt under language. Animals did not look you in the eye and ask you to help them commit a smaller injustice in the name of a larger good. By late afternoon, she would return home, cheeks burned by wind, memory cards full, boots white with dust or snow. Evenings were for editing, cropping light, adjusting shadow, bringing sharpness out of fur, feather, eye. She could spend an hour perfecting one image and feel more honest doing that than she had ever felt in a courtroom. Still, the old life was never as far away as she pretended. It lived in one locked drawer in the small desk near her bedroom window. She had told herself more than once that she should throw it all away. The bar card, the old case notes, the clipped articles, the legal pad with her own handwriting running down the margins in tight, slanted lines. But she never did. Some punishments worked best when they remained within reach. That night, before the Mare came to her porch, Jaime had opened that drawer for the first time in weeks. She had not meant to. Her hand had gone there by habit, almost absent-mindedly, while the storm pressed against the house. The bar card lay on top, still clean, still official, still carrying the name she sometimes felt belonged to another woman. Under it sat the file. Thin, ordinary-looking, cruel in its simplicity. Years earlier, there had been a negligence case, a facility, a preventable failure. A woman who had trusted the wrong system and paid for it with her life. Jaime had done what attorneys do. She had built the best argument she could from the facts she had. She had fought hard. She had believed hard. And she had still lost. Not just the case, something deeper, because after the ruling came the details that had never surfaced in time. The corners cut, the warning signs missed, the human cost measured too late. Jaime had walked out of that courthouse with the sickening knowledge that losing in law was not always the same as losing on paper. Sometimes you could be technically blameless and morally wrecked. She still remembered the judge's voice, still remembered the finality of it, still remembered sitting in her car afterward with both hands on the steering wheel, unable to turn the key because some part of her knew that if she drove home, she would have to continue being the person who had stood in that room and failed to stop what should never have happened. So she left instead. Not that day, not dramatically, but piece by piece, case by case, sleep first, appetite next, patience after that. Then one morning she woke up and realized she no longer believed in the machinery she had given her life to. She sold the condo, packed the books she could bear to keep, bought this ranch with land wide enough to make her feel small in a way that relieved her. People called it brave. It wasn't. It was retreat with better scenery. And yet, the land had changed her. Anyway, not quickly, not kindly, just steadily. It taught her weather first, then solitude, then the discipline of paying attention. Out here, the world did not care about her regret. Fences broke. Water froze. Coyotes circled. Light vanished early in winter. If something needed doing, it had to be done. There was a mercy in that. The prairie demanded presence, not perfection. Maybe that was why she first noticed the horses. A small band, never staying too long, appearing at the far edge of her property in the blue hour just before sunset, as if they were made from the same distance they traveled through. They moved with the caution of animals that belonged to no one and intended to keep it that way. And always, at the front, the Mare. Lean, watchful, strong despite the hunger beginning to sharpen her frame. The first time Jaime saw her through the lens, she felt something shift. Not sentiment, not softness, recognition, because the Mare carried herself like a creature who understood that survival and loneliness often traveled together. Jaime lowered the camera only after several long seconds. The Mare had stopped on the ridge. The wind moved through her dark mane. The rest of the band drifted behind her, but she stayed still, looking straight toward the house, straight toward the woman standing alone in the fading light. Not frightened, not friendly. Measuring. Jaime felt that gaze all the way across the frozen field. And though she did not say it aloud, though she would not have admitted it to another living soul, Something in her answered back. Not with words, with attention, with the quiet, dangerous beginning of care. By the time the mare turned and led the others over the ridge and out of sight, the evening had gone colder. Jaime stood there a moment longer, her camera heavy in her hands, watching the empty line where they had disappeared. She did not know yet that the animal she had just seen would one day walk through a storm to her front door. She did not know that trust was already beginning. She only knew one thing. For the first time in a very long while, something wild had looked at her as if she were still worth judging. Winter did not arrive all at once on the Wyoming prairie. It crept in slowly, the way doubt does. First, the grass turned brittle underfoot. The green drained away until the land looked like faded parchment stretched across miles of wind. Then the creeks began to freeze along the edges, thin glass forming where water used to move freely. The nights sharpened. The sun dropped faster behind the ridges. Every living thing on the prairie began quietly calculating how much strength it would take to survive what was coming. Jaime Carter noticed the changes the way she noticed everything now, with patient attention. Tracks lasted longer in cold soil. Deer moved earlier in the afternoon. Coyotes traveled in pairs instead of alone, and the horses began appearing more often. At first it was only once every few days. The small band would crest the distant ridgeline like a shadow against the pale sky. 6 animals most of the time, sometimes 7, always careful, always scanning the land before. Hitu stepping farther onto Jaime's property, and always the mare in front. Jaime never approached them directly. She understood enough about wild animals to know that closeness could destroy trust faster than hunger could build it. So she created distance instead. The hay came first. One morning, after watching the herd pass through thin grass for the 3rd time that week, Jaime loaded 2 bales into the back of her truck and drove them out near the far ridge, almost half a mile from the house, far from the barn, far from fences, far enough that the horses would not feel cornered. She dropped the bales, cut the twine, and spread the hay with her boot. Then she left. No waiting, no watching. Only later, from the kitchen window with binoculars resting against the glass, did she see them return. The band moved cautiously toward the scattered hay. Heads low, ears flicking. The young ones stepped forward first, curiosity overcoming caution. But the mare stopped them with a subtle shift of her body. She approached alone. Slow steps. Careful breathing. The kind of patience that comes from surviving long enough to know that every opportunity carries danger with it. She circled the hay once, twice. Only after several long minutes did she lower her head and take the first mouthful. The others followed quickly after that, hunger breaking whatever rules caution had tried to enforce. From the window, Jaime watched quietly. She told herself the hay was practical. A way to keep the horses healthy enough to photograph. A way to ensure they kept passing through the property where she could study them. It was an easy explanation, a convenient one. But some part of her knew the truth was simpler. She had looked at that mare and seen a creature walking the same narrow line she was. Survival balanced on stubborn will, and she had not been able to look away. Days passed, then weeks. The ritual settled into place. Jaime would drive out every few mornings and leave hay near the ridge, always in the same open stretch where the wind kept the snow thin, always far enough away that the horses could approach without feeling watched. And each time, the mare made the decision. Sometimes she waited until dusk, sometimes until the following morning. But eventually the herd always returned. Trust grew the way frost does. Quietly, almost invisibly. The distance between them shortened by small degrees. The herd no longer scattered at the sound of Jaime's truck. The younger horses began grazing even while she stood nearby, as long as she remained still. Once, a curious yearling wandered within 30 yards of her before the mare gave a low warning snort and called it back. But the mare herself never came close. She held her ground on the ridge or just beyond the hay pile, eyes fixed on Jaime with that same steady intelligence. Not fear, not acceptance, evaluation. As if she were asking the same question again and again. Are you the kind of human who takes, or the kind who leaves things better than you found them? Jaime never tried to answer. She simply kept the rules. No sudden movement. No chasing. No attempt to touch what belonged to the wild. Some evenings after dropping the hay, Jaime would stand on the porch with a mug of coffee while the cold sunset bled red across the prairie. The herd would appear on the far rise, shapes moving against the fading light, and always the mare paused, just for a moment, standing on the crest of the hill like a sentry. Looking back at the house, looking at Jaime. The moment never lasted long. The wind shifted. The band moved forward. The mare followed them down toward the hay, her dark mane lifting in the evening air. But Jaime began to notice something else. The mare was slowing. At first it was subtle, a slight heaviness in the way she carried her body, a longer pause before stepping down the ridge. Then, one afternoon when the light was bright and the horses were closer than usual, Jaime saw it clearly. The Mare's belly had begun to round. Pregnant. Far enough along that the shape could not be mistaken. Jaime lowered her binoculars slowly. The timing worried her. Winter on the prairie was brutal for healthy animals, let alone a mare carrying new life. Food was already scarce. Water sources were freezing. The coming storms would erase what little shelter the open land provided. The mare turned her head toward Jaime again, and in that instant, Jaime noticed another detail that hadn't been there before. A long scrape across the mare's flank. The hair rubbed raw, the skin beneath dark and healing. Barbed wire. Somewhere out there beyond the ridge, the mare had forced herself through a fence line, likely searching for grass or water or escape from something worse. Jaime felt a small knot tighten in her chest. A pregnant wild mare, an injured flank, and winter closing its grip around the land. The mare held Jaime's gaze for one last second before turning back toward the herd. The wind lifted snow across the ridge. Within moments, the horses disappeared again into the distance. But the image stayed with Jaime long after the light was gone. Because on the Wyoming prairie, survival was never guaranteed. And sometimes the difference between life and death began with something as small as one quiet decision. The decision to trust. By early December, the prairie had stopped pretending to be gentle. The wind sharpened. The sky flattened into long sheets of iron-gray cloud. The grass that remained above the frozen soil rattled dryly when the gusts passed through it. Everything that lived out here had begun the quiet arithmetic of winter. How much strength remained, how much food was left, how many storms the body could survive before it simply gave up. Jaime Carter watched the change the way she watched everything now. Carefully, closely. The horses kept coming. Not every day, but often enough that their presence had begun to feel like a rhythm stitched into the land. Jaime would leave hay near the ridge. The herd would appear near dusk or early morning. They would eat quickly, cautiously, always under the steady watch of the mare. Luna. Jaime had never spoken the name aloud, but in her mind it had become permanent. The mare carried herself with a quiet authority that made the name feel right. Even thin from the season, she moved like the land belonged to her. But something had begun to change. That was the first clue. Luna was slowing down. Not dramatically. A casual observer might not have noticed, but Jaime had spent enough hours behind a camera lens to read the language of animal movement. Luna paused more often. Her breathing seemed heavier after short walks, and the round curve of pregnancy that had once looked strong now looked strained. One afternoon, Jaime stood near the hay drop while the herd grazed 50 yards away. The younger horses chewed greedily. One of them kicked playfully at another, but Luna remained still longer than usual before lowering her head to eat. When she finally did move, Jaime saw her ribs shift sharply beneath her coat. Too thin, too tired. A pregnant mare should not look like that with winter still tightening around them. Jaime felt unease settle in the pit of her stomach. It was one thing to observe wild animals from a distance. It was another thing, entirely, to watch them lose strength and realize you might be witnessing the beginning of a tragedy you could not stop. The second clue arrived 2 evenings later. Jaime was returning from the ridge when she saw headlights far down the county road. That was unusual enough. Most nights that road stayed empty once the sun dropped behind the hills. The nearest ranch sat several miles away, and travelers rarely had reason to wander this far out unless they were lost. The vehicle slowed. Even at a distance, Jaime could see its shape clearly. A black pickup truck. It rolled to a near stop along the fence line where the property met the open prairie. The engine idled for a few seconds, exhaust rising in white clouds behind it. Then the truck moved again and disappeared down the road. Jaime stood still beside her truck, watching the empty stretch of gravel where it had been. Something about the moment bothered her. Not fear exactly, just the quiet instinct that someone had been looking at. The land the way hunters look at a field. Measuring. She drove back toward the house slowly, but halfway across the pasture she stopped again. Fresh tire tracks cut through the thin snow near the hay drop. They had not been there earlier that morning. Jaime crouched beside them. The grooves were deep and clean. Whoever had driven through had done so recently. Next to the tire marks, another set of impressions broke the snow's surface. Boot prints. Large, heavy. Jaime straightened slowly, scanning the empty prairie around her. The horses were gone. Only the wind moved through the grass. The third clue came the following day. It arrived in the form of Martha Red Elk. Martha's ranch sat 3 miles down the road, though ranch was a generous description. The place had once been larger before pieces of the land were sold off over the years. Martha herself was somewhere in her late 60s, with weathered skin, sharp dark eyes, and a voice that carried the steady authority of someone who had lived on this land long enough to know its habits better than most people knew their own families. She pulled her old truck up beside Jaime's gate late that afternoon. Jaime walked out to meet her. "You've got visitors lately," Martha said without preamble, leaning one elbow on the window frame. Jaime frowned slightly. "Visitors?" Martha nodded toward the distant road. "Black pickup. Been cruising around after dark." Jaime felt the quiet unease from the previous evening tighten. "You've seen it too?" "Couple times this week." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "Same truck every time." Jaime crossed her arms against the cold wind. "You know who it is?" Martha gave a small, humorless snort. "Oh, I know the truck." She shifted in her seat and looked out across the open prairie where the herd usually appeared. "Roy Maddox." The name meant nothing to Jaime, but the tone did. "Maddox does salvage work," Martha continued. "At least that's what he calls it." Jaime waited. Martha's mouth tightened. "After storms," she said, "he drives around looking for weak livestock, strays, injured animals, anything that looks like it won't make it another night." "And he takes them?" Jaime asked. "If there's paperwork, he claims he's rescuing them." Martha shrugged. "If there's no paperwork, well, sometimes nobody asks questions." Jaime turned her gaze back toward the ridge, toward the place where the herd usually appeared. "Wild horses?" she asked quietly. Martha followed her gaze. "If they're strong enough to run, he leaves them alone," Martha said. A pause. "But winter has a way of changing that." The wind picked up, pushing snow across the road in thin, drifting waves. Martha reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. She handed it to Jaime. "That's Deputy Lena Hart's number," she said. "County Sheriff's Office doesn't always care about things out here. Lena does." Jaime slipped the paper into her coat pocket. "Thanks." Martha nodded once, then started her engine. As her truck rolled away down the road, Jaime stood at the gate watching the empty horizon. The prairie had grown quiet again. Too quiet. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind a thick wall of clouds, Jaime stepped inside the house and turned on the small weather radio that sat on the kitchen counter. Static crackled for a moment. Then the broadcast voice came through, calm and mechanical. Winter storm warning for central Wyoming counties. A major blizzard system expected within 48 hours. Jaime stood very still as the forecast continued. Heavy snowfall, extreme wind, whiteout conditions expected across the plains. The kind of storm that erased roads. The kind of storm that killed animals that were already weak. Jaime looked out the kitchen window toward the ridge where the horses would soon appear again. Somewhere out there was a pregnant mare already running on borrowed strength. And somewhere on the county road was a black pickup truck with a stock trailer. The wind rattled the window glass. Jaime exhaled slowly. Because storms didn't just reveal what the prairie could destroy. Sometimes they revealed who had been waiting for the chance to take advantage of it. And winter was coming fast. The blizzard arrived like judgment. There was no gentle beginning, no graceful drift of first snow. 1 hour the prairie was gray and tense, holding its breath beneath a swollen sky. The next, the world vanished behind a wall of white so dense it looked solid. Wind slammed into Jaime Carter's ranch house hard enough to rattle the window panes in their frames. Snow streaked sideways across the yard. Fence posts disappeared one by one. The barn became a pale blur. Then even that was gone. Inside, the house shrank, not in size, but in feeling. The kitchen, the mudroom, the narrow hall to the bedroom. Suddenly they were not rooms in a home, but pockets of shelter in a world being erased. The power went out before sundown, came back for 3 minutes, died again. After that, there was only lantern light, the hiss of the propane heater, and the constant roaring beyond the walls. Jaime moved through the darkness in layers. Boots, wool socks, thermal shirt, heavy sweater, coat over all of it. She kept the faucets dripping, checked the pipes, fed the horses in her own small paddock, broke ice in the water trough twice before midnight and once again before dawn. And all through it, she thought of the wild herd, thought of Luna. Out there somewhere beyond the ridge, a pregnant mare was facing this storm without walls, without heat, without dry hay stacked in a barn. Every time the wind hit the house, Jaime imagined it hitting flesh instead of timber. Imagined Luna turning her body against it, shielding her belly, digging through snow for grass that wasn't there. She tried the phone twice. No signal. Tried the weather line on the radio. The same warnings repeated in a flat mechanical voice. Whiteout conditions. Travel impossible. Life-threatening exposure. As if naming danger made it smaller. By the second day, drifts had buried the lower half of the porch steps. The sky and ground had merged into one endless moving sheet. Jaime opened the front door once, and the wind almost tore it from her hand. Snow exploded into the entryway. Cold knifed through the house. She shut it fast and stood there breathing hard, humbled by the force of something that did not know she existed. This was the truth of the prairie. Not beauty, not romance, indifference. It would let a newborn die and never pause to notice. Late that afternoon, during a brief crackle of signal, Jaime managed to get one short call through to Martha Red Elk. "You staying put?" Martha asked, her voice rough with static. "For now," Jaime said. "Any sign of the herd?" "Nothing. Can't see 10 feet from my own porch." A pause. Wind swallowed half the line. Then Martha's voice came back, lower this time. "After storms, people go looking for what can't run." The connection died. Jaime stood in the kitchen holding the silent phone, Martha's words settling into her like cold water. That night she barely slept. Every groan of the house sounded like a warning. Every gust felt personal. Toward morning, she dreamed of hoof prints filling with snow before she could follow them. dreamed of a black pickup idling behind a curtain of white while something living and helpless struggled in the drift. When daylight finally came on the third morning, it was weak and colorless. The storm had not ended so much as exhausted itself. The wind still moved, but with less fury now. The snow fell lightly, almost gently, as if trying to disguise what it had done. Jaime was outside within minutes. She dug her truck out enough to clear the doors, then gave up. The drifts were too deep past the gate. So she took the ATV as far as she could, then abandoned that too where the path vanished under packed snow. After that, she went on foot. The cold bit instantly through her gloves. Each step sank to mid-calf. The land looked wrong, smoothed over, flattened, robbed of all familiar lines. Fences had become white humps. Gullies had disappeared. Even sound had changed. The open prairie, usually so full of distance, now seemed muffled, as if the storm had buried not just the grass but the world's ability to answer back. Jaime reached the hay drop just after noon. The first thing she saw was movement. The herd. They emerged from behind a low rise one by one, thin shapes against the snow, heads low, coats frosted, their hunger visible in the way they made straight for the hay she had left before the storm. One young horse stumbled, caught itself, kept going. Another's flank showed a fresh cut. Jaime counted automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then she stopped. Luna was not with them. The absence struck harder than any sight could have. Jaime scanned the ridge, the draw beyond it, the open stretch leading toward the creek bed. Nothing. No dark mare. No watchful head lifted above the others. No steady gaze fixed on her from a distance. Only the herd, eating fast and nervously. Only the place where Luna should have been. Jaime's pulse began to pound. She moved away from the hay, following the edges of the open ground, reading the snow as best she could. Hoofprints overlapped in churned confusion. Wind had softened them, but not erased everything. Then she found it. A patch of disturbed snow near a cluster of sagebrush, half hidden beneath a drift. She knelt. The white had been broken there by frantic movement, hoof marks cut deep, a body turning, collapsing, rising again, and on top of it, faint but unmistakable, a stain. Blood. Not much, but enough. Next to it lay something else, pale against the snow. Afterbirth. Jaime stared at it, her throat tightening. Luna had foaled out here, in the storm, alone. She stood too fast and nearly lost her balance. Her eyes searched wildly for the rest of the story, for small tracks, for drag marks, for any sign that mother and foal had moved on together. There were hoof prints leading away, one set deep and uneven. Then the wind had taken them, just erased them. Jaime turned in a slow circle, staring out across the white emptiness until the scale of it threatened to crush her. Somewhere in all that open land was a mare who had given birth in a blizzard. Somewhere was a newborn, with hours, maybe less, if no shelter had been found. And somewhere, maybe, a black pickup could be watching the same silence. She heard Martha's words again. After storms, people come looking for what can't run. Jaime stayed out longer than she should have. She searched the creek line, the far fence, the hollow near the cottonwoods where snow sometimes drifted less deeply. By the time she turned back, the light was already fading and the cold had become dangerous in a new way. Not sharp, but numbing. She reached the house after dark, exhausted and empty-handed. Inside, she peeled off frozen gloves and stood in the kitchen without turning on more lights. The lantern on the table threw a small golden circle across the wood. Outside, the prairie had gone dark again. The house was still. Too still. Jaime lowered herself into a chair, every muscle aching, and pressed both hands against her mouth for a moment as if she could hold back the helplessness rising in her chest. Then it came. Knock. She lifted her head. A single hard impact against the porch. Her heart stopped. Knock, knock. Not wind, not loose wood, a hoof on the boards. Jaime was already on her feet before the third strike landed. Jaime Carter reached the door before the third knock finished echoing across the porch. Her heart was already racing, though she could not yet say why. Some instinct deeper than logic had recognized the sound before her mind could give it shape. Hoof on wood, not wind, not chance. Her hand paused on the handle for half a second. The porch light switch sat just beside the frame. She flipped it. Yellow light spilled outward into the storm. Snow twisted through the beam in thin, restless spirals. The wind had weakened since the blizzard's peak, but it still carried the sharp bite of open winter. The porch boards were half buried in drifted white. And there she was. The Mare. Luna stood in the center of the light, her dark coat dusted with frost and snow. Her sides rose and fell in ragged breaths. Ice had gathered along the edges of her mane, stiffening it into pale strands that clung to her neck. For a moment, she looked less like a creature and more like something carved out of the storm itself. But it was her eyes that held Jaime still, wide, exhausted, and fixed on the door as if nothing else in the world existed. Jaime opened it slowly. The cold poured into the entryway, sharp enough to sting her lungs. Luna did not step back. She did not bolt the way a wild horse should have the instant a human appeared. Instead, she remained where she was, trembling faintly as though the act of standing had become the last thing her body could manage. Only then did Jaime see what lay behind her. Just beyond the porch steps, in the shallow hollow where snow had drifted against the boards, something small moved. At first it was only a shadow in the snow. Then the shape shifted. A tiny leg kicked weakly against the drift. Jaime's breath left her in a rush. The foal! He was smaller than any colt she had ever seen in photographs or in life. His coat was still damp in patches where birth had not yet dried. The wind had already begun frosting the hair along his back with fine, white crystals. His entire body shook in uneven tremors, the desperate rhythm of something fighting cold that had already begun to win. He tried to lift his head, managed barely an inch, then it dropped again. Luna lowered her muzzle and nudged him. Once, twice, a soft, urgent push that carried no force, only exhaustion and a kind of aching insistence. Get up, please. But the foal could not. His small chest fluttered rapidly beneath the thin coat. Each breath seemed to cost more than the one before it. Jaime stepped onto the porch. The wind pulled at her coat and tangled her hair across her face, but she barely noticed. Her entire attention had narrowed to the tiny body lying half-buried in snow. Behind her, the warmth of the house glowed through the open doorway. Ahead of her, winter waited patiently. She moved slowly, instinct guiding her movements the way it might guide someone approaching a frightened child. Luna's ears flicked forward, then back again. Her muscles tightened, once as Jaime crouched beside the foal. For a second, the world balanced on that tension. Wild instinct against desperate trust. Jaime lowered one gloved hand and touched the foal's side. Cold. Too cold. The tremors in his body were already weakening into something slower, more dangerous. He did not even flinch at her touch. Alive, but only barely. Jaime swallowed hard and slid her hands beneath his chest and hindquarters. The colt was astonishingly light. Not the sturdy weight of a healthy newborn, but something fragile and unfinished, as if life itself had arrived too early and wasn't sure it should stay. The moment she lifted him, Luna shifted. Her hoof scraped sharply against the porch boards. Jaime froze. For one suspended breath, the storm seemed to quiet, as if even the wind were waiting to see what the mare would do. Luna stepped closer, not threatening, not retreating, just close enough that Jaime could hear the rough rasp of her breathing and smell the cold sweat of exhaustion rising from her coat. She stretched her neck toward the foal in Jaime's arms. Her muzzle brushed his damp mane once, gently. Then she lifted her head and looked straight into Jaime's eyes. It was not fear that lived in that gaze. It was something harder. Decision. The mare had carried this foal through a blizzard, had crossed frozen ground and drifting snow to reach the only place where she had ever seen kindness offered without a rope attached to it. And now she was placing the rest of the decision in human hands. Jaime felt the weight of it settle into her chest. Not a gift. A gamble. "You brought him here," she whispered. Her voice sounded almost lost in the wind. Luna's sides heaved once more. Jaime tightened her grip around the small trembling body. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, I've got him." She turned toward the barn. Each step felt suddenly urgent. The cold was biting deeper now that the foal's fragile heat rested against her arms. His breathing fluttered weakly against her sleeve. Once, his head rolled slightly and she felt the terrible slackness of muscles already giving up. "Stay with me," she murmured without thinking. Behind her, Luna followed. Not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to disappear. Just a few slow steps across the porch and into the open yard, her hooves crunching softly through the snow as if she were afraid that any louder sound might break the fragile thread holding her foal to life. The barn door groaned as Jaime shoved it open. Warm air rolled out to meet them. The heat lamp over the nearest stall cast a soft orange glow across the straw. The familiar smell of hay and wood wrapped around them like shelter itself. Jaime laid the foal down gently in the fresh bedding. For a moment, he did not move. His head fell sideways against the straw. The tiny tremors stopped. Jaime's stomach dropped. "No," she whispered. She knelt beside him, pulling off one glove and pressing her bare hand against his neck. The skin beneath her fingers felt frighteningly still. Behind her, Luna gave a low, broken sound. Half nicker, half grief. Jaime rubbed the foal's chest harder, trying to force warmth back into limbs that had already begun surrendering to cold. "Come on," she said under her breath. Outside, the wind rattled the barn walls again, and somewhere beyond the frozen fields, the long winter night was closing in once more. Because if the foal did not breathe again in the next few moments, this would become a very different kind of story. For one terrible second, the barn held its breath. The foal lay motionless in the straw. His small body looked impossibly fragile under the warm orange glow of the heat lamp. Jamie Carter kept rubbing his chest with both hands, harder now, trying to force warmth back into muscles that had begun surrendering to the cold. Come on," she whispered. Nothing. Behind her, Luna shifted inside the stall doorway. The mare had followed Jaime into the barn but stopped just beyond the threshold, uncertain of the wooden walls and human scent surrounding her. Her ears flicked nervously. Her ribs rose and fell with slow, exhausted breaths. Then the foal's chest twitched. A small movement, barely visible. Jaime leaned closer. Another weak flutter followed, air pulling into tiny lungs that seemed unsure whether to keep working. "There you go," Jaime breathed, relief breaking through her voice. "That's it. Stay with me." The foal's breathing remained shallow, uneven, but it continued. Jaime reached for the thick towel hanging on the stall gate and began rubbing the colt's body briskly, working heat back into his frozen limbs. The straw rustled under the effort. Warmth slowly crept through the stall as the heater hummed overhead. Still, Jaime knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. She grabbed her phone and stepped a few paces toward the barn door where signal sometimes reached. 1 bar. Just enough. She dialed quickly. The line rang twice before a tired voice answered. "Cole. Dr. Cole. It's Jamie Carter out on Ridge Road," she said, her words rushing together. "A mare brought a newborn foal to my porch. Premature, severe hypothermia. I've got him under heat, but he's barely breathing." A pause. Then the veterinarian's voice sharpened instantly. "How long ago was he born?" "I'm not sure. There was afterbirth out on the ridge earlier today. He must have been lying in the snow for hours. Another pause. Keep him warm, Dr. Ethan Cole said. Rub circulation into the legs. I'm coming. You can get through the road? I'll find a way. The call ended. Jaime returned to the stall and continued working. She massaged the foal's legs, his chest, his neck, anything to keep the blood moving. His breathing steadied slightly under her hands, though each breath still looked fragile enough to disappear if she stopped watching. Luna stepped closer. The mare's hooves touched the stall threshold, then hesitated. Her nostrils flared as she leaned forward, sniffing the air around her foal. The unfamiliar barn made her uneasy, but something stronger held her there. Her baby. Jaime eased back just enough to give the mare space. It's okay, she said softly. Luna lowered her head and touched the colt's neck with her muzzle. The foal stirred faintly. A weak sound escaped him, barely more than a breath. The mare answered with a low nicker, deep and trembling. For the first time since arriving, she stopped pacing. She stood still. Outside, the winter night thickened. Snow whispered against the barn roof. Minutes passed slowly, measured only by the foal's fragile breaths and the steady ticking of the heater. Then headlights swept across the barn wall. Jaime looked up. A truck engine growled somewhere near the gate. Dr. Cole arrived moments later, stomping snow from his boots as he pushed through the barn door carrying a heavy medical bag. The veterinarian was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard dusted with frost. One quick glance at the foal told him everything he needed to know. "Good thing you called," he muttered. He knelt immediately beside the colt. Cold hands became steady, practiced ones. He checked the foal's gums, lifted one eyelid, pressed his stethoscope against the tiny rib cage. "Hypothermic," he said. "Dehydrated. And too early." Jaime's stomach tightened. "Can he make it?" Dr. Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a small tube and syringe from his bag, working with calm efficiency. "He's alive," he said finally. "That's something." The tube feeding took several tense minutes. Jaime held the foal steady while the vet worked carefully, guiding warm fluids into the colt's stomach. Slowly, almost stubbornly, the little body began responding. The tremors eased. The breathing deepened. One small leg twitched. "There we go," Cole murmured. "That's better." Luna watched every movement with fierce concentration. She remained silent now, but her eyes never left the colt. Jaime sat back on her heels, exhaustion creeping into her muscles. For hours she had been running on adrenaline alone. Now that help had arrived, the weight of the night settled around her. Dr. Cole finished adjusting the heat lamp and leaned back. "He's not out of danger," he said quietly, "but he's fighting." Jaime nodded slowly. Behind them, the barn door rattled once as a gust of wind swept across. The yard. And then something else appeared through the slats in the wooden wall. Headlights, different from the veterinarian's truck. These lights were farther away, near the road beyond the gate. They lingered there, not moving. Jaime stood and walked to the barn window. Through the drifting snow she could see it clearly now. A black pickup, idling. Behind it, barely visible in the darkness, the outline of a stock trailer sat waiting. Her stomach tightened. Roy Maddox. The truck remained still for several long seconds. Then the engine revved once and slowly rolled away into the night. Jaime watched until the lights disappeared beyond the ridge. Behind her, the foal gave a faint, struggling nicker. She turned back to the stall. Dr. Cole was adjusting the blankets around the tiny body while Luna stood quietly nearby, no longer trembling quite as violently as before. Jaime rested one hand against the stall rail and exhaled slowly. All evening she had believed the storm was the worst thing the prairie could deliver. But standing there in the dim barn light, with the newborn colt fighting for life and a black pickup disappearing down the road, Jaime understood something colder than the winter wind. Sometimes the storm was only the beginning, because out here, when the snow finally stopped falling, other kinds of predators came looking. Morning arrived slowly over the prairie. After the violence of the storm, the land seemed almost stunned by its own survival. Snow stretched across the fields in smooth, pale waves, reflecting a cold, silver light from the rising sun. The wind had quieted, leaving behind a stillness so deep it felt almost sacred. Inside the barn, warmth held its fragile ground. The foal lay in fresh straw beneath the heat lamp, wrapped loosely in blankets Dr. Cole had left through the night. His breathing was steadier now, still weak, but no longer fading. Every few minutes one small leg twitched, as if his body were remembering how to belong to the world. Jaime Carter sat on an overturned bucket nearby, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but refusing sleep. She had not left the barn since midnight. Across the stall, Luna stood quietly. The mare had not moved far from the foal all night. At first she had paced restlessly, uneasy inside the unfamiliar space. But as the colt's breathing strengthened, her movements slowed. Now she stood with her head lowered near the stall rail, watching him with the silent intensity only a mother could carry. Jaime looked between them and felt something settle deep inside her chest. For the first time since leaving the courtroom years ago, she felt useful again. Not clever, not strategic, just necessary. The sound of tires on packed snow broke the quiet. Jaime lifted her head. Through the barn doorway she saw a truck approaching slowly across the yard. Not Dr. Cole's. This one was black. Her stomach tightened. The pickup rolled to a stop near the gate. A man climbed out, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who believed he already understood how the conversation would go. Roy Maddox. Jaime stepped outside before he could reach the barn. The air cut cold against her face, but she barely noticed. Snow crunched under her boots as she walked halfway across the yard and stopped. Maddox glanced toward the barn behind her. "You've got a foal in there," he said. It wasn't a question. Jaime folded her arms. "How do you know that?" He shrugged. "Word travels." His eyes drifted past her again toward the barn doors. Not cruel eyes exactly, just practical ones. The kind that looked at animals the way mechanics looked at broken machines. "Storm hit hard," he continued. "Horses get separated, foals get left behind. Happens every year." "And you come collect them?" Jaime asked. "Sometimes." Maddox spread his hands. "I salvage what I can. Get them fed, cleaned up. Some make it. And the ones that don't?" He didn't answer that part. For a moment, the wind slid quietly across the open pasture between them. Then another truck approached from the road. Deputy Lena Hart stepped out before the engine had fully stopped. She walked up beside Jaime without a word, her badge catching the morning light. Maddox's expression shifted slightly. "Didn't expect company," he muttered. Hart gave him a level look. "You're not taking that foal," she said plainly. Maddox exhaled through his nose. "Deputy, I'm trying to help. That animal won't survive out here." "He survived the night," Jaime said quietly. Maddox's eyes flicked back toward the barn again. For a second, something else crossed his face, something less certain. He shifted his weight and stared at the snow between them. "My wife's been sick," he said suddenly. The words came out rough, almost defensive. "Hospital bills stack up fast out here. Ranch isn't pulling what it used to. Salvage work keeps the lights on." Jaime studied him carefully. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't innocent either. Desperation had pushed him across a line long ago, and once someone crossed that kind of line, it became easier each time. "You don't get to take what's weak just because life made you desperate," Jaime said. The words landed heavier than the cold air. Maddox looked up slowly. Something in his eyes softened, only for a second. But it was enough. Deputy Hart stepped forward. "You've made your point," she said. "Now you can leave." Maddox stood there another moment, staring toward the barn where the foal lay fighting for his first real day of life. Then he turned back toward his truck. "Storm's not over yet," he muttered. "No," Jaime said quietly. "It isn't." The pickup drove away across the snow-covered road, growing smaller until the prairie swallowed it completely. Silence returned. Deputy Hart watched the horizon a moment longer, then turned to Jaime. "You did the right thing." Jaime nodded, though she wasn't sure yet what that meant. Months passed before the prairie softened again. Winter loosened its grip slowly, melting into muddy fields and thin green shoots pushing through the thawing ground. The days grew longer. The wind warmed. Life returned in small, stubborn signs. And in the pasture, beside Jaime's barn, the foal grew stronger. She named him Storm. At first he wobbled on thin legs, uncertain of his own balance, but each day he stood a little taller, ran a little faster. His coat darkened, his eyes bright with the wild curiosity that belonged to creatures born under open skies. Spring finally arrived with quiet sunlight and distant thunder. One afternoon, Jaime stood by the fence watching Storm graze when movement appeared along the far ridge. A familiar band of horses stepped slowly into view. 6 shapes, and at the front, Luna. The mare paused at the crest of the hill. Even from that distance, Jaime could see the strength returning to her frame. Winter had carved deep lines into her body, but she stood tall again, the same steady leader she had always been. Storm lifted his head suddenly. A soft sound escaped him. Across the pasture, Luna answered. The young colt ran toward the fence with surprising speed, skidding to a stop just before the wire. Luna approached from the other side until only a few inches separated them. Mother and son. Their noses touched through the fence. Storm trembled slightly as he breathed her in, recognition traveling through instinct deeper than memory. Luna stood there for a long time, not trying to take him back, not trying to cross the boundary, just watching him, making sure he lived. Jaime rested her arms on the fence and felt tears rise before she could stop them, because the mare had not come to her door that night to give her a gift. The gift had come later. Trust. A wild creature had placed her newborn in human hands and believed, against everything instinct had taught her, that kindness might exist on the other side of fear, and that trust had given Jaime something she thought she had lost forever. A second chance to be the kind of person who stayed. Some storms destroy, but once in a rare while, a storm delivers a life into the hands of someone finally ready to protect it.